I'm Nicola Muirhead from IDD here. It's a privilege for me to chair this awesome panel, really interesting panel. Every single presentation seems to fit very nicely with the theme of the conference. I'll be very strict, time-wise. I'll be really strict. I have little, signs here. 2 minutes, 1 minute. So it's 10 minutes each, please, so we can have a little bit of time for the conversation. 20 minutes after each presentation, hopefully. And I'll introduce each one of you before your presentation. So let's start with James. James Comov, that is a doctoral researcher with us at IDD. And his presentation is on memory politics, subjectivity, and the overdetermination of suicidal youth agency. That's a mouthful.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
The case of Tibetan self-immolation.
Sure. Hi everybody. First I'd like to say thank you. I'm just trying to negotiate the chair. I'd like to say thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the Conveners for organising this really interesting conference. As Nick said, my name is James. I'm currently finishing my PhD here at IDD, which is, the title is Inheriting Loss, Cultural Trauma, Political Subjectification and Youth Agency in the Sino-Tibetan conflict more generally, but specifically with the diaspora community in North India. And the point I'm coming from is the way in which legacies of violence and historical trauma in exile mark subjectivity amongst youth and go on then to influence agency. I actually kind of subvert perhaps or come at it from an opposite perspective from most orthodox trauma theory, even kind of the more Lacanian psychoanalytical theory, and look at it from a cultural trauma perspective. Philip mentioned that earlier, and that basically sort of implicates the way in which communities construct traumas rather than them being a natural phenomenon. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. To take a step back, though, first, I'd like to as is often the case, I've come to my interest after I finished doing my PhD, and that is what I'd like to talk about first. I think the more general ideas which I have kind of come to realise. On the screen are three young people. You might recognise their faces, you might not. About 4 years ago, we heard a story of this young woman, Samira Kasinovich, who fled Austria, or her family in Austria, to join Islamic State in Syria, and she was unfortunately killed a couple of years later after she was hoping to return home. The young man in the middle, Dorje Tsering, we found out in just the beginning of March, a young Tibetan lad in exile who committed suicide by self-immolation. The third young lady, Santana Marie Janis, a young girl from the Oglala Sioux community in North America who hung herself tragically about a year ago now, actually. For each of these people, we have a different narrative of explanation. The first, we often hear tales of criminalisation or radicalisation, normally for a cultural religious impetus. The second, we normally have stories of quite the opposite, actually, a valorised sense of cultural resistance, an act against an aggressive foreign power and a defence of one's culture and community. And the third, actually a little bit more of a complex case. Traditionally, young people committing suicide from indigenous communities, of which there is a large now literature and concern for, have been explained with reference to psychopathology or to more exigent, urgent concerns in the here and now, such as internal problems of sexual abuse within the community that have led on to certain acts. Each of these I find to be ethically problematic to an extent and constitute acts of what Ian Hacking calls, got these the wrong way around, sorry, I added these a moment ago, memoropolitics. So these all constitute acts, from my perspective, of underdetermined accounts of explanation, transient teleological accounts that Philip was talking about earlier, of how an event, a particularly violent event in somebody's past, are supposed to influence their future and their agency. And we can have kind of generally clinical or cultural explanations of these, the clinical appealing to ideas of pathology and trauma, the cultural generally trying to explain acts with reference to sort of acts of resistance, which I also find equally as problematic to an extent. I come at it from the theory of political subjectification, which builds from Foucault's work, that of Judith Butler, Pierre Bourdieu, Hacking, and Didier Fassin, the French anthropologist and clinical psychiatrist who I'm most interested with, who rejects orthodox approaches to understanding the subject and their subjectivity. So these are not subjects for him who are the rational autonomous actors represented by a certain kind of sociologist, such as Boudin or Terrain, nor are they the subjectivities buried in the consciousness or unconsciousness explored by psychologists or psychoanalysts, even those unconventional ones like Slavoj Žižek, so not kind of built around a negative lack. Instead, he appeals to the notion, drawing on Althusser, of interpolation, which talks about the way that social normativity, culturally constructed conventions and discourses produce the subject, and not only produce a subject, but also a subjectivity that conforms to that injunction. So the way in which subjectivities and subjects are constructed through medical discourses, such as discourses of trauma, through perhaps cultural discourses, or so on. This corresponds also to work, what Foucault calls historical ontology. And I was really interested with Lucy's presentation earlier, because this refers to kind of the technologies of self and others through which the subject and the subjectivity can actually be produced within a specific historical frame. And in particular, the advent of the trauma victim, which is a particular discourse of subjectivity and modernity. But my project also involves then the tension between this and those relations of power that constitute that subject, and also the wider material discursive theme. So we have on the one hand these underdetermined accounts of subjectivity. This young person committed this particular act as an act of cultural defiance, or because they had a particular event in their past that compelled them to do so in a pathological framework, to look more at the wider context as well, their gender, class, other positions that might have led to and overdetermined a particular action. So the one thing I'd like to mention, how am I doing for time, Nick, actually, before
3 minutes.
3 minutes left.
Yeah.
So the one thing I'd like to talk about for 3 minutes, and I can always respond to more questions if there's a problem, is the Tibetan self-immolation. So as a very brief history and account, I don't know how familiar you are with the Sino-Tibetan conflict, but depending on your politics in 1950s, China, the People's Republic of China, led by Mao, either occupied or peacefully liberated Tibet. Anyway, in 2008, there were a large number of protests that fled up in various regions of Tibet, and in 2009 we started to have a spate of self-immolations in the region, mostly in Tibet, but there have also been 8 in the exile community too. It appears to be a popular protest, and the way that that's been explained on either side is for the PRC, as I mentioned earlier. These acts of mostly young people have been, some of them as young as 15 years old, have been explained in terms of psychopathology, manipulation by elite elders, and so on. Whereas on the other side, we have kind of various nationalist explanations, largely talking about it, however, as acts of resurgent, parhesiastic national consciousness. This is a term of sort of the body as being a truth-telling mechanism to disclose and to illuminate the truth of what's happening on the plateau, which is the ethnocide and oppression of Tibet and Tibetan people and culture. It's kind of split between a religious explanation and between one of defiance and resistance against the PRC. How am I doing?
1 minute?
Okay.
2 minutes.
The point, I think, rather than be too tied to the presentation, while these two narratives exist, and while there's always a propensity to, particularly among people who are sympathetic, and my positionality is such that I am critically sympathetic of the Tibetan community, both accounts here are underdetermined. Both appeal to very simplistic narratives of action. The one, actually, the nationalist account, is the one that's more permissible, and I've been at conferences where people have tried to challenge the nationalist account, and actually it's resulted in quite a hostile atmosphere just because the activist, the sympathetic, sentiment is so strong, it closes off alternative explanations. But it's clear that there are other explanations to be had, or other readings. While the nationalist account is at least partly true, we can see by the distribution of the immolations, mostly around certain monasteries, largely among religious communities, almost exclusively male, with the exception of 20 young women who I find particularly an interesting point, that their gender is generally invisibilised in the narrative of explanation. Age as well, there's a generational dynamic. So there is this kind of misrepresentation of the acts as being largely a cultural act of popular nationalist consciousness, but actually there are all these other factors that are influencing the subjectivity, constituting subjectivity. But some of the areas, or one of the issues that concerns me from an ethical perspective, is how actually this representation of the national hero power in Tibetan has come to be a mode for self-constitution as well. And you have now young people like Dorje Tering in exile just a few months ago, who actively constituted himself as a national hero through self-destruction. And that's how he's been represented, and it's encouraged in a sort of a passive way. There's been a lot of criticism about the way that it's been dealt with by authorities. But when we sort of look back through his own statements, while he identifies as a martyr, he also references other problems, such as problems at school, problems with families, which was elided from the narrative that was then discussed. So I'm sort of interested, and coming back to Lucy's presentation earlier, with this, what Foucault calls the historical ontology of ourselves, the way in which people constitute through certain representations, but the tension also with different material pasts and the wider material discursive field that actually contributes to the production of subjects and subjectivity. So I think I'll just stop there, and then I can always refer to more questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Next is Lydia Cole, PhD student at the Department of International Politics at Birmingham University. Thank you very much, Lydia, for making the journey from Wales. Our presentation is on the production of the victim subject, counting, accounting, and bodily injury.
Right. Can you hear me at the back? Sorry, I know I sometimes speak quietly. Okay. So the paper is taken from one of the empirical chapters of my thesis, which focuses on questions of subjectivity and the production of victimhood in the case of gender-based violence in Bosnia. So the chapter that I'm going to be talking about today focuses on how this victim subject is produced through practices of accounting in contemporary Bosnia. I'm going to be focusing in particular on the civilian victim of war status within the welfare system in Bosnia, and how this is applied to victims of wartime sexualized violence. So whilst this status covers a wide range of wartime injury, I'm choosing to focus particularly on the victim of sexualized violence, since its differing treatment across the constituent entities of Bosnia brings out kind of the differing status afforded to wartime victims in different parts of the country. So in the paper I discuss literature on counting and body counts, and I don't really have time to go into this in too much depth today, but I'm just going to say that the issue of counting has become particularly important in the context of the victim of wartime sexualized violence. Firstly, it's become a way of drawing attention to war harms. For example, the number of 20,000, with reference to those who were raped in the conflict, is often used in memory and awareness-raising practices. Secondly, because this number is also highly contested. Different sources can quote anything between 20 and 60,000 people, and it points to an obvious difficulty of knowing how many people this actually happened to. And then thirdly, since the contestation over counting bodies also becomes a contestation over ethnic identity in particular. In the case of Bosnia, the narrative of genocidal rape has come to frame victimhood in terms of a particular ethnically defined victim. So I suggest that through this use of body count, individuals counted have their identity as victim determined in advance, And I suggest, along with Edkins, that even when someone counts in the way that Westerners count, they count for not who they are, but what they are. So I next turn to look at administrative systems and processes designed to support the victim, such as reparations. Though there isn't a reparation system proper in Bosnia yet, there are several proposals that are being discussed. And people often talk about this civilian victim of war status in the same kind of way as reparations. So they're kind of a similar, if not exactly the same thing. So during my discussions about reparations, the issue of recognition kind of recurred as an important theme here. And I'm just going to quote here. So one of the main aims of transitional justice is to return, or in some cases establish anew, the status of citizens to individuals. So to the extent that a reparations program aims to contribute to the achievement of justice, and that recognition is both a condition and a consequence of justice, this links reparations and recognition. So the question that I'm interested in here is, what does it mean to recognise a person, and on what terms might this be able to happen? Fraser, for example, has suggested that recognition claims tend to promote group differentiation. And I think what I try to argue in the paper is that recognition requires a deeper form of justice than this. And de Graaf hints towards this when he states that it's necessary to recognise individuals as irreplaceable and unsubstitutable human beings. I think that's a really important kind of point here. So I suggest that the mode of recognition which manifests itself as recognition as part of a victim group, rather than recognition in this other form, as part of the kind of the irreplaceable and unsubstitutable human beings, is particularly problematic, and it's something that becomes particularly evident through administrative approaches to reparations. Okay. So support for the civilian victim of war is dealt with through the social welfare system. Can you all see this? Yeah. Which requires an individual to come forward and register as civilian victims of war, with specialised commissions which assess the person and their claim. In the case of a victim of sexual violence, the person would typically need to provide medical documentation as evidence of treatment dated from immediately after the occurrence of the rape, as well as sufficient evidence from an authorised organisation that's providing the person with assistance. In the Federation, which is kind of in the centre of Bosnia, benefits for civilian victims of war are far more generous and encompass quite a wide range of war-related injury. And it also includes some provisions for family members. Up until 2006, all civilian victims of war needed to prove they had suffered at least 60% bodily disability as a direct cause of the war. In 2006, due to kind of some interesting kind of social movements and things that I also don't have time to go into, but I'm happy to take questions about, a change in the law meant that war rape survivors were defined as civilian victims of war without needing to prove this bodily disability. So these persons are afforded special status within the law and are entitled to a full benefit on par with that of Category 1 beneficiaries, which is about £205 a month. So in the Republic of Srpska, which is kind of to the north and the south of the country, family members are not provided support through this civilian victim of war payment, and it's comparatively quite difficult to achieve recognition in this status, especially for victims of wartime sexual violence, as they do need to prove the 60% bodily disability, which obviously when you've suffered this particular form of harm is quite difficult to prove. So as you may have noticed in the tables on the PowerPoint, bodily injury is measured in terms of a percentage in this case. And to me, this seems like a very strange way of counting bodily injury. And to me, it begs the question, what does it mean for someone to be at least 60% disabled, or otherwise be at the intersections of such categories? So I put this question to a number of my interview participants with the following responses. At Snaga, Jenny and Tuzla, I was told, in the Federation we know for some percentages. For example, for PTSD, that gives 60% of disability. However, only if you have 90% or 100% of disability you're entitled to get financial assistance for your disability. And for example, we have one of our women from Modrica. She was raped during the war, and she was released from the concentration camp. She had to get an abortion, a surgical procedure, which is pretty traumatic for the body and for the mind. Besides that, she has diabetes and hypertension, but she did not manage to obtain the invalid right through the commission. I believe in Republika Srpska they would only give 20% for mental pain, for example for PTSD. So in another conversation with a woman named Sidika who worked for a survivor association, I brought up the issue of 60% disability for women living in Republika Srpska. So Sidika says, I laughed when I heard this question. So the doctors and the commissions are the ones who judge it, and they judge it through the length of your stay in the camp and the assessment of consequences and traumas that is left on you. It's very subjective when it comes to this assessment, but the level of 60% disability provides us with the opportunity to receive free treatment. So these examples, I think, show the lack of clarity and the subjective nature of this measurement of bodily disability. And I think it's clear that in the system, individuals kind of are recognised in as far as they gain a particular status of civilian victim of war rather than kind of as a person. So those who gain the status usually talked about the benefits that the status awarded them, rather than any kind of possibility of recognition in the status itself. So I'm just going to actually conclude by reflecting on a particular conversation I had with a psychologist who worked at Birmingham, who works with these people. And it's a rehabilitation and therapy centre based in Tuzla. So during my fieldwork, I've kind of found that a lot of my interviews were quite sanitised actually when they were talking about victims of wartime sexual violence. It was quite kind of instrumental in a sense. And I think I liked this conversation because it stood in quite stark contrast to this. So I'm just going to read out a quote from my transcript. This reconciliation, it's one of the newest themes. Everyone wants reconciliation and everyone should live quite happily in Bosnia ever after. And I think in the first place we would like that. But reconciliation cannot take place without, in the first place, rehabilitation. You must work through your traumas to have some kind of openness and feeling for the traumas of other people, for what happened to them. And talking about what happened to everyone. It's a basic for starting to understand each other. Now, I'm not talking about politics. Politics, they divide people. What we are doing is talking to victims, let them talk about their traumas, and then just not judge, not insult, just talk about what happened to them. Because everyone has their own story. So I think this just kind of shows that there's a sort of tension between the different approaches in Bosnia to kind of post-conflict justice. And I think people like the psychologists are obviously doing a much better job than this civilian victim of war status. So I think I'll end there.
Thanks a lot. Two great presentations that talk to each other through this body, the story of the body. Now let's turn to Raquel da Silva, doctoral researcher. It says here that it Institute of Applied Social Sciences, but really you're based at IDD, we all know that. The title of your presentation is Political Violent Activism in Times of Social Turmoil, the life stories of former clandestine militants in Portugal.
Yeah, which I changed slightly because, you know, my abstract is massive for 10 minutes, so I was like, no, good. I will talk 10 minutes. So, but it's okay, it's just the title. This Portuguese scholar really got it in terms of what I'm doing. So he just says that the data about what I do, which is to study former political violent activists in Portugal, is very often scarce, but also contradictory. It has never been transferred into paper and only relies on memory, the most perishable of things. And I agree with him, and this is what I want to talk about today, memory, identity, and how people today position themselves. But let's look at other things. So in terms of my PhD, I use critical terrorism studies and I use narrative analysis to understand the experiences of former political violence activists in Portugal. I'm sure you don't really know the history of Portugal. I don't have time to go into that, but you just need to keep in mind that we had an authoritarian regime from 26 till 74, and then we had the revolution, and in this time we had political violent organizations that those tried to fight the regime and bring up to the revolution, and then after that we had counter-revolutionary organizations and post-revolutionary organizations. Very complex. I can talk more about that afterwards. In terms of narrative analysis, because this will link to what I'm going to talk about identity and memory, because that's really what frames how I view identity and memory. What are narratives for me? They are cultural and social resources that enable individuals to put their stories together, giving meaning to themselves and to the world, and shaping their personal identities. How is this done? Through stories and through storytelling. The stories people share with me, but with everyone around them. So it's through stories that they will connect and shed light on the social, cultural, political, historical, and human context that frame their own lives. So that's why, for me, talking to these people is so important, because their stories will shed light on all these contexts that I'm really interested about, and as like the other scholar said, are not written about in Portugal specifically, and are just living in the memory of people. So I'll just focus on how are the meanings of the past memories dialogically used to preserve the value identity. And to talk to that, I will bring one of my interviewees and his story to illustrate. But first of all, what is narrative identity? And I think Margaret Summers has a really good article on this, where she says that it is through narrativity that we come to know, understand, and make sense of the social world, and it is through narratives and narrativity that we constitute our social identities. All of us come to be who we are, however ephemeral, multiple, and changing, by being located or locating ourselves, usually unconsciously, in social narratives, rarely of our own making. And this is what I'm trying to look at. And then, if we think of autobiographical memory, this is an active construction embedded in social weave of dialogues that are negotiated not only between an individual and his or her immediate social environment, but also equally importantly between the individual and the larger cultural milieu. So this is what constructs our autobiographical memory, because I don't think we need to discuss that we don't remember things exactly as they were, but how we construct them. And finally, and not wanting to go into lots of selfhood and psychology here, but Brunner really says that the self relies on selective remembering to adjust the past to the demands of the present and to the demands of the anticipated future. So how we see ourselves, how we imagine, and this links again to Lucy's presentation, how we imagine our possible selves, and this influences how we tell our past stories. And then Mischler just adds to this and says that the same identity-defining episode may be told very differently in different circumstances, originating multiple life narrative storylines and constructing different identities. So it's not that the person is being false, but it's just that in that context, this identity makes sense. And I'm perfectly aware that my interviews had a certain context to it. And I returned to some interviewees for the second time, because I interviewed them first in my master's, and I could already find some differences, but I could also find loads of continuity, because this is a very well-rehearsed story. You know, it was in the past. They had all these years to keep performing it, and as it is clear, changing it. So I'm bringing you Jaime today. Just a little bit of story of Jaime. He's the youngest of 10 siblings. He started working at age 12 after finishing primary school, and he was 18 when the revolution took place. And this is really important. So Jaime was born during the dictatorship, and he gives two reasons to justify his political awareness and activism. Having been born during the dictatorship, so this is key for him. I knew the dictatorship, and having worked, so being a worker since he can remember. I would also add that the revolution was really important for him, because he did not even know dictatorship, but he also knew the new freedom that really politicized this young generation. And young, I'm talking about 14 till early 20s, and these are my interviews from the last organization. They were highly politicized by this change and by this new freedom. And Jaime is one of them. So he told me, and that was really, really interesting. You know, after the revolution, everything was great. But 2-3 years after, it was as the capitalist families had gone on holiday after the revolution and then came back 3 or 4 years later untouched to occupy the same positions in society as before. His organization acted 10 years after the revolution. So in this period where things were returning to how they were before. And it's in this context that Jaime started defending that violence is a weapon that can be used according to the political analysis of a certain situation. So he becomes involved with FP25, which he saw as the armed arm of the workers against the abuses of employers, meaning that shooting the knee of an abusive employer would be an attempt to convey a practical message for both sides, for the employers and for the victims who had been laid off. If there was a guy who was not paying the salaries or who had fled to Brazil, the guy needed to realize that he could not do that. And since the state did not act, at least there were some guys that would keep him fighting, and the same guys were them. So for Jaime, the victims were perpetrators. So the victims of the organization, they were perpetrators, and that's why they became victims. So there's no regrets whatsoever in his stories. In fact, he even says that, you know, I mentioned all this in my wedding day. The violence is a political tool, is a political weapon. He was shot and he was arrested, and that's how his story in the organization ended. And 4 years before his sentence finished, the government gave an amnesty to all fighters in jail, and he did not accept it. For him, the most important thing was to pay his debt to society, and only by then be able to live unreservedly. And these are his words, and he kept telling me this, and this is really good. I'm the last prisoner who got out of jail. It closed the inquiry. I am the person who spent more time in jail. And you suddenly see the doors opening, everyone leaving, and you stay. Because you would not sign a paper. You have your dignity. I owe nothing to society. Therefore, I consider myself an activist, a political activist who was with others in the political struggle until the end of the fight. I risked it all, and suddenly I lost. I lost, and such a defeat brought 10 years in prison, but I left without owing anything to society. Because I served the sentence until the end, I did not get out in a pardon or with an amnesty. I left with my time served. I served it all. I owe nothing to society. These are the bricks of Jaime's identity, you know? I'm free. I did it. I paid. Now I can do whatever I want, basically. So he considers that the past provides him the sense to position things in the present. So I also interviewed his wife, that was also part of the organization, and she told me, you know, Jaime is always talking about the past. I never talk about the past because I'm someone else. Jaime, no. He is his past, because he told me, I need to think about the past and remember the past to understand who I am now and to guide who I am now, because I'm still an activist. And he says, you are facing someone who, despite everything regarding his social, ideological, and civic participation, maintains the same posture he had 25 years ago. Yeah, as it is clear, it might be different, but for him, this is really, really important. And then he goes like, I'm a leftist man. I have a very strong convictions about social justice and quality of life, which I have kept intact since I've been involved in the political struggle for 30-odd years. Exactly the same thing. And this is the final one. And this is interesting, just because the continuity also includes radicalized views. If he was here, he would be a security threat, because he told me many times over the interview that, you know, he's not against terrorism. He didn't become, because he was in jail or because now he's 50-something, he still thinks that violence is a weapon, and he still thinks that in some contexts it's the only weapon. So, and this is what he's saying here, rewinding what I experienced in the 80s, I do not say that if I was 20 years old today, and this was 2013, that I would not do the same. Due to my way of seeing society and of being integrated in that society, I am unable to live with injustice, with the arrogance of those who have a uniform or a tie or a pen. I cannot live with it. Now, what will Giant do? Do you think I'll get away ahead of the police at 57 years old? I can no longer escape. This is something of which I'm completely aware. Now, that does not stop me from looking at the situations that I face every day and saying, what we need here is the FP25 or something else to bring at least some justice regarding what we're facing. So his views did not, and he goes on and he says, you know, if someone else does it, I'm not really pointing the finger at them. So here we can see someone that really built his identity, and he needs his past, as it is clear he constructs his past to bring meaning to his present. And for him, it's all about his past. He is active in a political party, he is part of the local government, and he keeps going, but always bringing the past, which is really interesting because many other people that I interviewed, they never talk about the past. Their children don't know about the past. So this is quite interesting. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Very interesting. Now, last presentation, Christina Baghdadi from the law school here, and Kim Barker from the Wolverhampton Law School. The title is this thing? Yeah, Children of the Social Media Revolution, Conceptualizing Protest Identities Through the Arab Awakening. The floor is yours.
Thank you. We've had 3 fascinating papers already. Caveat, I don't have a political background, I'm a lawyer. So we kind of approach things in a very different way. My interest is in the regulation of the internet and social media online. And so part of that, and through discussions with Chrissy, kind of led us to a discussion of what we do online, the protests we have online, and whether or not we have different identities when we're online, an online self, if you like. And that's quite an odd concept for me, because I spend a lot of time arguing that we don't have an online self, that we are actually just one self, whether we're online or offline. So I guess our starting point is, if we're online or offline, we're all part of a community. That is the starting point. Yes, we're individuals, but we're part of something bigger. In this room today, we're a community of people discussing subjecthood in different guises. That's just one example. But every different community has a different meaning. People have different ideas about what their community is, what they do within a certain space. Why? Because we believe in something, and if we share that belief, then we have a different community in which we exist. And that all forms part of the identity. If we have a shared understanding of something, then we have a shared idea, we have a shared set of ambitions, a shared set of goals, shared ideas about where we're going. But is it just about community? Or do we have identities within that community? And our stance in the context of the Arab Awakening discussion, which we'll come to, is very much that identities are part of a community. And if you're part of a particular community online, you have an online identity which connects you to that community. Particularly when we look at social media. I'm guessing everybody is social media active in the room. It's difficult to find somebody who's not social media active. Does that mean we have a different identity when we're online? To a certain extent, yes, particularly through forms of protest. If we're protesting online or we're activists online, be it overtly or covertly, in many respects we have a different identity which we're willing to project compared to the identity we would have offline. Online platforms, online identities allow us in many respects to act differently because we're online. So you might do things online you might not necessarily do offline. You may be more vocal in an online context about elements of protest, you might not be. But whatever you do, if you have an identity online, you can use that to join a community you might otherwise not join. So if you have a certain hashtag, for example, then you can join that community virtually, even if you don't join that community physically in an offline context. And so for us, there's a significant connection between your online identity and the community that that identity allows you to join. And if you think about that in the context of protest, then you have shared ideas, shared interests, shared identities, and ultimately that allows the removal of barriers where there may otherwise have been a barrier. Particularly when it comes to protest. So if we're thinking about protest and we're thinking about what we do online and what we share online and how we go about doing things online, then ultimately in the context of subjecthood and whether or not we're citizens or subjects or something else, then ultimately our identities are a form of protest, particularly through hashtags. What we're doing online is not always anonymous. We're not being anonymous online, even if we're joining a community. We can have a profile which doesn't identify who we are. We can have a profile which says we're interested in certain things, whether or not that's actually what we're interested in. It's not about anonymity. It's about an identity and a trail and a connection which you can reach in an online space, particularly if you're an activist of some kind in an online context. Traditionally, when we think about forms of protest, we think about the physical, getting together with a group of people, having a protest. That's one form of protest. But there tends to be problems with that, and there tends to be an outcome from that which is very different to that which may happen online. You may not be able to physically involve yourself in the demonstration, but if you're online, no matter where you are, you can connect with people who are involved in that demonstration, and you can move forward and play an active role, even without being physically present or connected to the people you'd otherwise be connected with. Why? Well, we've called the presentation Children of the Social Media Revolution, and we think that there is a significant generational shift to forms of identity online and offline. Why? Well, if you're of a particular generation, you're more active online than you would otherwise be. Are you an online activist? Quite possibly. Why? Because you have the means to be an online activist without being an offline activist in the same way. Why? Because it comes back to community. You have a hashtag that creates a community. You can join in that form of protest by using the hashtag. It becomes part of your online identity. Whether or not you allow it then to morph into your offline identity is a different issue and a different discussion. But all of this makes a lot more sense when we talk about it in the context of the Arab awakening.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to give you a bit of a background on myself, I'm not a lawyer as such. I work at the law school, but my background is in international security in particular, and my master's dissertation was in particular about the Muslim Brotherhood, and this was before the revolution. And at the time of the revolution in 2011, just to give you a bit of background before we get back into this, I was working from home for the entirety of the revolution, so from December pretty much until February and March. So I had the luxury of having access to Twitter, which I was not active on before this had actually happened, before the revolution had kicked off. I had access to Al Arabiya on one station and Al Jazeera on one station, and I was sitting and writing my political analysis on what was going on. So maybe I could be the subject in this particular case. The Arab awakening. So I remember just before this had kicked off, one of our friends had contacted us. His father was a minister at the time, and he stated that something very big was going to happen on the 25th. To which my response and some of our responses was, well, if it's going to be on the ground, that nothing is going to happen because of the fear of the security. It was a fear of, you're going to be captured, you're going to be in prison, no one's going to see you again, and that was going to be the end of that. And then I started to see for myself what was going on Twitter, and then I also became equally as active as well as an observer on that. We said that earlier, it's perfectly possible that a community can arise purely to support a campaign, and that campaign, I believe James had sort of slightly touched on it with the self-immolation. It started with, I think it was Khaled in Tunisia, who set himself alight, full parliament, and it set domino effect throughout. It's particularly evident through the Arab awakening in this particular case with the social media. Open Democracy had released a report in 2014, some years later after the revolution, and they highlighted that more than 60% of the Egyptian population is below the age of 35, and 50% of the country use the internet regularly. So we're looking at statistics of, say, there's over 90 million people, Egyptians, and we're looking at over 50% around, so over 45 million people, whether they be stationed in Egypt or externally, who are active on social media, whether it be on Facebook, Twitter, you name it. That's what, 45 million, 50 million now? Not only does that create a huge potential for engagement with online communities that I've observed, but it also is a contributing factor for the uprising of a viral nature. And in the context of this Arab revolution, we had individual grievances, but there was one common cause, and that common cause developed into, we can't stand this regime anymore, we need change. There was a generational difference. There was there were people connecting, whether it be on generation, whether it be a political alliance, whether that grievance is on the social class. We're just fed up with what's happening right now. Kim had very beautifully designed the citizenship, community, identity, and characteristics of self. Lucy, I believe you touched on this on some level. I think, can you actually really dissect the self, the soul, on some level? You were talking about a gentleman who had written his own diary, but to me, when I go onto Twitter, sometimes I can observe, I can put down my own comments, and that for me is my own personal diary on some level. And that just makes me think, like, objectively of myself, like, how many layers do I have? Citizenship as well, that common cause, doesn't necessarily have to be condensed just to within a state. We saw here that it was a case of so many people who lived not just within Egypt, but first generation, second generation, those Egyptians who lived in America, my generation, who lived out in the UK, in Europe, and so on. We all had a particular shared cause. Technology, the mechanisms of spreading democratization through moves beyond the grasp of state control cannot be underestimated at all. Social media mobilizes activism within this particular case. As a result, online communication methods and digital platforms facilitate the creation of new cultural norms and generational shifts. And that's something that we can probably discuss in the question and answer session. The qualities that make Twitter seem insane and half-baked are what makes it so powerful. Can it really be underestimated? Absolutely. We saw that within the revolutions it was. We saw that even not only in 2011, but even in the 30th of June 2014, there was a movement that came to then remove another president within Egypt. There was a shared feeling, a shared community. People were not happy with the Muslim Brotherhood in power at the time, or at least we're looking at 30 to 40 million who were disgruntled about it. And they again went through Twitter. The second time this happened, though, it wasn't just a case of online, it was a case of a movement that happened online, on TV, within embassies, people getting in contact with each other. It was a shared movement through and through. Online, can it be more covert? We saw that in 2011, one of the things that I observed, I watched this particular interview live, and I don't know if you've heard of Wael Ghanem. Wael Ghanem, he used to work in Google, and he was arrested at the time before January. He was arrested, he got taken in by state security, and he was released, and he spoke of his experience on Ashra Mased. It was a TV show in the evening. It was aired everywhere. I remember watching this live. It was a very emotive thing. This guy, originally, before he was even arrested, he was very active. He was very active within Google. He worked within it. After he came out, he was crying, he was upset, he was frustrated with the way that the state had treated him and the rest of society. Pretty much a day or two later, even more people, no matter the social class, had hit to the streets. Covert can be equally as much, it can push the overt, and that's what happened in this particular case. And that's it for the question and answer session.
Thank you very much. Great. Well, obviously it's 11:30, so but I hope that the organizers will agree with me and maybe give us 15 minutes. Is that all right? Yeah. Looking at the different organizers. Someone said yes. That's sorry. Okay, so 15 minutes, yes, for questions. Please keep your questions as concise as possible. The answers as well. Let's try to go to the point so we can answer as many questions as possible. Yes, easy.
Question to Raquel. The whole narrative thing is something I'm exploring deep and I found that fascinating. It was really good talk. So, in what ways were you able to take the individual story, and I found that particular case study, if you can call it that, really interesting. In what way were you able to take that individual story or any others and extrapolate at the level of society or kind of commonality or social identity or shared struggle, if you see what I mean? Because it seemed quite a unique story in itself. Were you able to peel away from it things that allowed you to connect all the others together in some form of kind of broader narrative or story that pulled the thing together, in other words?
Yeah. I have a question for the last presenter. Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Christina.
Yeah, I was wondering about that question towards we change when we, we're active online, yeah, in whatever context. Personally, I'm interested in the hate crime online, whether that reflects what people think, or whether that kind of is, well, it's not just about, presenting yourself differently online, but actually being someone different. Because if we then go back to theoretical ideas about identity, where it is about that dialectic between selfhood and sameness, are we still the same, or do we actually change, or is it about, more like Goffman, like presenting yourself, and those sort of ideas? So I don't know if you've thought about this before, but theoretically.
Good.
Yes, I have a question for James first. How do you relate this action of violence or self-destruction to the construction of the subjecthood? I mean, there's this contradiction there. It's like we're trying to destroy the idea of the self-subject when we carry on this kind of violence action, or you have a different perspective. And also for Raquel, I think, yeah. Quite connected with your question as well. If you have seen cases in your study that when the memory has been hid or forgot or ignored sometimes, what happened with the present identity of those activists or those political subjects? So, like the opposite of the case you showed, if you can give some ideas. Thank you.
Okay. The two last questions, okay?
Mine is brief anyway. It's to the lady who talked about the conflict justice in Bosnia. Sorry, what was it?
Lydia.
Yes. Thank you. It's a great presentation. But my question is very much about. So, what's the narrative or the perspective of the government who designs and delivers this sort of a very weird conflict justice program? So, how do they construct their perspective of their political subjects? What's the rationale? Because clearly it seems like almost they're providing this service, but they don't really want to provide the service. But what's the narrative there? Why?
Right, I have a question. This was a fascinating panel. Thank you so much. It worked so nicely together. I have a comment/question to the last paper. I would like to know what is your research material? I mean, I had no problem with the theoretical introduction. I had lots of problems with the empirical part. So I would like to know what is your material, data, methods, what are your sources in a historian's speech, and also whether you are familiar with the immense amount of literature that has been written about this ever since in all kinds of fields. Would it be in media studies, would it be in political science, and so on. Because there were some, when you're talking about people, it would be good at least to get the names of the people who died rights, whether out of respect for them or out of intellectual honesty. And very final sort of comment, it was interesting for me to see how the dialectics between a sort of the online perspective on the Egyptian revolution and Raquel's paper on political violence, because the massive research that has been done on this topic shows, marginalizes to a large degree, or problematizes and critically reassesses 5 years on the role of the social media, and so on, and puts much more emphasis on political violence, on productivity of violence, on the people who were putting their bodies on the front line, and these were the people who carried on the revolution, firstly. Secondly, bringing it back online. What is actually more interesting, rather than revamping this old, worn-out, activism and violence. Sorry, I don't mean it against you. I'm sort of wrapping up a field and where it is now. What is more interesting to look at now is how these selves that have been completely destroyed and reshaped by total events, because that's the threat that links here. It's selves completely remade in total events, would they be revolutions, wars, civil wars, other forms of total events. How these shows were reconstituted and how they continue this through online practices and through ways of remembering and narrating themselves online, posting images of martyrs, of those who died, of their memories of the revolution.
All right, food for thought here. So, who wants to start?
I can start.
You can start. Go ahead. Let's try to take
yeah.
3 minutes each.
So my goal was never to generalize, and so my goal was to study their experiences. And I'm not talking about massive organizations. I interviewed 5 people in each organization, and still I'm not representing the organization, because for that I would need to interview everyone. And within the organization, each organization, there are people with very different views. So my goal was to represent my interviewees' experiences, and which talk to other literature on the subject. For example, I talk a lot about disengagement, and there are quite a lot of literature on disengagement. And yes, I can relate to that literature, why people disengage. Yes, in my interviewees, I have and I analyze a lot on that, so I can sort of corroborate or add or go against to those theories, you know. And this was my aim. Also, there's very little narrative studies, like, real good ones, deep ones on this matter, so I can also bring it. And very important, I can link the narratives to the context, which is what I really wanted to do. I wanted to understand the context through the narrative of my individuals, and I think there's loads of value here. In terms of forgetting, and in fact there's a bit more than forgetting, there's the counter-narrative, and there's what history says and what my interviewee says, that in some cases were not really, together. So, but again, so my epistemological, ontological choices were really, that's their stories. And this is how they chose to portray them to me. And that's what I'm showing. And then there's my critical analysis, as it is clear, and showing other people's views, the historians' views, but also other people in the same organization views, and also this almost sort of link together. So my analysis is basically weaving, all these narratives together and bringing all these different perspectives in the same issue. I couldn't bring here today, but there's really some of them. They say, yes, as it is clear, he said that he didn't kill him, but what did you want him to say? Did you want him to assume, because some organizations do not assume their killings, so there's a lot of that. So basically I try to bring them all together to talk around the table. So did I answer your questions?
No, you did, Karen.
Thank you.
Good. Who wants to have a go at the questions? James? Yeah.
In relation to violence and the subject, this was actually exactly where my work started. So I was interested in following up a question posed by Arthur Kleinman, who's a physician and a psychologist and now an anthropologist, who talks about trying to understand the ways in which violence marks the subject and subjectivity. And this was kind of my point of departure. What I've tried to do throughout my project is historicise this. So generally the relationship between violent events and subjectivity is highly kind of it's reified and it's made very sort of abstract. It's generally terms in clinical terms, it's generally terms in sort of concrete terms. I was more interested in kind of how these experiences, both violence and suffering, come from the outside rather than the inside. So they're historical conditions. We know how to suffer because of our historical conditions. We identify violence through historical conditions too. So I think in linking the two together, I've been very influenced by Foucault, and the idea that the author does not precede the text, which is applicable to acts such as suicide as well, self-destruction. It's hard to swallow perhaps because we're generally accustomed to thinking about suicide as an act that's either coming from the inside from some pathological condition, or we've taken that choice freely, agentially, to make a statement, to claim that. I kind of criticise both, or hold both of those at arm's length, to look at the way in which suicide is a narrative or a position. The suicidal position is one that people assume, not necessarily through their own choice. So I tried to back off the idea that young people just see this suicidal martyrdom as a position through which they can construct themselves as somehow free choice, and look at the way in which other factors behind that have also influenced it as an appropriate response to a particular set of conditions. So that's been the tension throughout my work. Exactly your question is, how far can we see a sort of a materiality to violence in the past that compels action against our will, but also suicide as being a kind of a possibility, a possible way of action to address the terms of cultural recognition.
Good. Thanks, James.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I probably should have
spent some more time actually talking about the structure of Bosnia. So there is a state government, but the laws are different in the two entities because most of the laws are passed at the entity level rather than the state level. So the Republika Srpska is kind of the entity which is the kind of Serb-dominated entity, and then the federation is sort of largely, I think, like Muslim and Croat area, which was kind of decided at the Dayton Peace Accords. And there's also Brčko district, which I didn't talk about today. So it's kind of a complicated governmental structure in any case. And I think this is where the issue of numbers and counting really comes in, because with regard to wartime sexualized violence, this is something that was kind of argued over in the peace accords and continues to be argued over. So mostly in the Federation, they claimed that most of the victims were Bosnian Muslim, which is kind of the case, but there's also a lot of victims of basically these are the Serbian women who were also victims of this kind of violence in the war. And so in the Federation, there's more of an appetite to deal with these issues because it fits with the narrative of war victimhood. And the entity, the Republika Srpska then is less willing to engage with this issue because it doesn't fit with their particular narrative of the war. Although interestingly, when I was doing some research on different reparations proposals, I was told that the Republika Srpska were really keen to participate in kind of instituting a formal reparations process. And the reason for this, I was told, was actually they thought that most of the people who would be claiming have now left the country, so that actually it would kind of make them look better to bring in. So I think there's kind of a lot going on, and probably a lot still to unpack in the work.
Thank you very much.
So
2-3 minutes, huh?
So the first question about kind of hate crime and being active online and whether we change. I don't think there's a clear answer to that at the moment. I don't think we know. There is quite a body of research from psychology suggesting people are nasty online because they're nasty offline. And some of the Twitter troll case law would seem to suggest that actually people are not nice in person, so they're not nice online. But that is very much a counter-argument to the possibility that there are people who are nasty online because they're not nasty offline. I don't know that we know yet. I think there's work to be done in that area. And my other interest is hate crime online through social media, so I'm quite happy to discuss that over coffee if you want to. As for the second kind of question comment, it's not an empirical study. We haven't done empirical research on it. It's very much a kind of, it was a sideline out of something else that arose in a legal regulation context. And so we kind of looked at the identity aspect more than anything else, but there is a lot to be said about selves, and I think that's naturally where the debate is moving.
Okay. Sounds like you can answer. You have something to add?
That was useful.
All right. Last thing then to add is just to thank you all for this great presentation, great questions as well. So, thank you very much.